Indigenous Peoples of the World project, I really wanted to focus on the nomadic peoples of Kazakhstan. When I was a little girl, I actually lived in Kazakhstan for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012. My parents were teachers at an international school there, and I still am very, very thankful for my time there. It was such an enriching experience that really widened my worldview, and so I really wanted to talk about that. But in doing this assignment, I also really wanted to acknowledge very humbly how much I still have to learn. Being 6 to 10, we moved there when I was in 2008. From ages 6 to 10, you're not really aware of a lot of the cultural implications that come with living in another country. So I really wanted to learn more and just remind myself how much more there still is to know about the culture, and I wanted to make sure that I was going about my experience and talking about it in a way that was really respectful to the people living there, because they've already taught me and given me so much. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of why I chose to do this topic. Some of the learning outcomes that I wanted to focus on were the basic aspects of the traditional culture, to give just a small snapshot into their lifestyle and what their everyday looks like. I want to talk about some of the modern pressures on the lifestyle, because quite unfortunately a lot of these pressures have influenced this newer movement of really maintaining individual Kazakh identity and making an extra effort to preserve it. And finally, I wanted to look very briefly at some of the commonalities with Canadian Indigenous peoples. Some of the elements will be very obvious throughout the presentation, but I also wanted to touch on that because I find that in taking a step back and looking at some of the larger implications and patterns, it's a lot easier to see the biggest things that we need to focus on and that we need to learn about. And often in learning these things as well, we can figure out how to best approach these walks of life and how to best help them in maintaining their traditional cultural identity. I wanted to touch a little bit on the actual physical land of Kazakhstan, the geography of the country, because the land of Kazakhstan is so important to the people living there. It's so central to their lifestyle. So I want to talk a little, just some trivia about Kazakhstan. It's actually the ninth largest country in the world and the largest landlocked country in the world. Now, you may be looking at this map and saying, Kate, it's not landlocked. The Caspian Sea is right there. But in official records, the Caspian Sea counts as a lake rather than an ocean. So it's a little bit interesting, but the Caspian Sea influences a lot of the climate in the western part of Kazakhstan. As you'll see later, there's a lot of variety in the landscape. But again, as you can see, this map gives a little bit of context to where Kazakhstan is. It's very common for people to not know where Kazakhstan is, which is very common. I mean, I'm sure I wouldn't know if I didn't live there. But as you can see, it's south of Russia and west of China, and right in the middle of Central Asia with the other Stan countries, as we call them here in the West, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The topography of Kazakhstan is also very important. One of the very crucial landmarks in Kazakhstan, which actually really isn't totally in Kazakhstan, it's more in Kyrgyzstan and China, as you can see here on the map, is the Tian Shan, which means sacred mountain. So we often say Tian Shan Mountains just to distinguish what it actually is in English, but it means sacred mountains. And this mountain range influences primarily southeastern Kazakhstan, even though it's not totally in that portion of the land. There is still some that comes into the borders of Kazakhstan, but it influences a lot of the climate. So I often talk about Kazakhstan, their climate, as being quite similar to Canadian climate. It's, they have hot summers and cold winters, but at any given time it's about 10 degrees hotter. So the coldest it would get in the wintertime would be maybe 20 degrees, and the warmest in the summertime would maybe be 40. But the actual climate and the atmosphere is a little bit different because the Tian Shan Mountains block out a lot of wind in the southeast, which is where a lot of the urban centers are and a lot of the population, because it's a very beautiful place in the southeast of Kazakhstan. So it blocks out a lot of wind, which results in the warmer temperatures, but also it's kind of a strange thing. There's no wind. I mean, in the wintertime, you could have several inches of snow on your clothesline. So that was quite interesting. But yeah, so it affects that, and it's also very dry. That's not related to the mountains, but that part of the climate. It's very dry in Kazakhstan, so like I said, it would get as hot as 40 degrees, but that isn't, it doesn't feel like a 40 degree there because it's just dry. And the same thing with the wind that I talked about before. Because there's no wind, 20 degrees doesn't feel as bad as a 20 degrees here. It's a lot more mild, actually. So I just wanted to go through a couple examples to show visually how much variety there is in the landscape. So this is in the southeast near, Almaty. This is very common, having the mountains and then boreal forest there. There's a lot of lakes nestled in as well. Very beautiful. It's on a lot of tourist pamphlets and websites. Even if you just go on the Google search bar and type in Kazakh landscape, most of the images will look something like this. It's very beautiful, and often a lot of the nomadic populations are in this area as well because it's just so green. I mean, you can see just looking at the picture. And moving a little bit more north and a little bit more into central Kazakhstan, you would get landscapes that look like this. This was taken in the summertime, so it's very dry as well, but these landscapes are a lot more flat and very arid as well. And then finally, in the far west, you'd get formations such as this. So, like I said, very unique, a lot of variety in the landscape, and it influences a lot of where populations reside as well within the country. So, like I said, the land is so important because the main means of sustenance for nomadic Kazakh people is animals, actually. Animal husbandry is the most common way of life within the people. So, as you can see here on the right, it says the nomadic lifestyle centers around the livestock, and depending on the size and the wealth of these nomadic communities or families, it really depends on like what the population is made up of, whether it's just an extended family or where there's friends that are living together and migrating together. But really, depending on the size and the wealth, you'd see anything from sheep to goats to cattle to horses and even camels. So the landscape does influence a little bit, and you would see more camels a little bit more in the west-north part of the country, but it's actually quite unpredictable what you may stumble on when you're out in Kazakhstan. All of these are very common in Kazakhstan, and they use a lot of different animals to get what they need. So, for example, while I was living there, I had both goat's milk and camel's milk. Now, here in the West, we usually think, you just have cow's milk, but it's not the case in Kazakhstan. And I talked about this as well briefly before, because they rely so heavily on these animals, they make use of seasonal pastures. So they, depending on the time of year, they move to different locations, which will, they have a long-standing tradition of knowing where their animals will reap the most vegetation from the earth, the most grass. So they move on kind of a cyclical cycle in terms of getting their food and their, like I said, means of sustenance. Livestock is so central to the culture that it's also worked its way into the blessings and curses. So a very rough translation from the Kazakh wording, essentially, if it's a blessing, then it's simply may your animals be healthy and multiply. And it's pretty much the exact opposite for a curse. So I found that really interesting, that it's even become part of the language, that it's so central, these animals, to their way of life, that it's worked its way into conversation as well. So here you can see, this is an image of a modern Kazakh shepherd. You can tell by his rubber boots and his zip-up hoodie and his cap with the brim like that, that this was not taken a long time ago. This is a quite modern outfit, but I really love this photo because it gives a great snapshot into the attempt to preserve a lot of their way of life, despite modernity. So, and you can also see a lot of the landscape in the background. That's a very common image in the southeast as well. So this enclosure would be a night enclosure. Often during the day, the sheep are free to graze along these hills, but the enclosure itself would either be the materials, like the posts and the wire, would either be left behind for the next group to come in and make use of, or it would be packed up and taken to the next seasonal site. So a lot of the materials that they use are not refined, they're not manufactured. You will see uses of wire or barbed wire, but they mainly rely, like you can see with these fence posts, on more raw materials that they can get from their surroundings. I want to talk a little bit more about the animals as well, outside of livestock, that really help the Kazakh people in their lifestyle. On the left here you can see two men, this little boy, and it would be his father or an uncle in the background with their birds of prey. So they either use falcons or eagles to catch smaller game. Foxes and weasels are really common, and they use the fur from this smaller game for furs. You can see some examples in their clothing here in this very picture, actually. So fur clothing is very important in the colder months, and it's also a very integral part of their traditional clothing as well. So it's been used historically, but often now it's a way of maintaining a bit of cultural identity. They wear these clothings often in festivals or public demonstrations. And here on the right, we see what most people in Kazakhstan would call a kafkas. That's a bit of an umbrella term, but it's a guard/shepherd dog. They're often very large like this, although they can be smaller and a bit darker as well. But, this is very typical of a kafkas. It's a traditional herding and guarding dog, like I said, and it's often used to move their sheep or their cattle from place to place, but also an essential part to keep wildlife out. It's very interesting, though, that these animals, the dogs, have also worked their way into the urban centers. People in Kazakhstan do not have pet dogs. They usually only have guard dogs as well. So that's kind of a traditional aspect of life that has carried over into modernity, which I find really interesting. Like I've kind of mentioned before, the Kazakh people rely heavily on nobility. However, I wanted to make a little bit of a distinguishing remark, because the term nomadic is actually a bit of a misnomer for the Kazakh people, because they are really quasi-nomadic, which that's a bit of a mouthful to say every time, so I think that's why the term nomadic has kind of stuck rather than being specific and saying quasi-nomadic. But like I touched on before, they rely a lot on seasonal pastures, so the term seasonal nomadic, quasi-nomadic, or seasonal migrational is a lot more specific, actually. And because of their reliance on mobility and seasonal pastures, the ability to transport their goods, including their homes, is very important. So that's a perfect segue into talking about the house or the home. And here we see a traditional yurt. Now, kind of like Kafka's, yurt is a umbrella term, although it's much more widely applied to a lot of different traditional housings across Central Asia. So this one is a little bit more elaborate. You see a lot more decoration on this one than you would typically see on ones that are often moved around or used in everyday use. As you can see, it's on a stone base as well, so this would be a little bit more of a permanent dwelling or used for tourist purposes. So talking a little bit more about the home, I mentioned the term yurt. So as you can see in this previous one, it's a circular structure with kind of a conicular, I think that's how you pronounce it, a cone-shaped roof. And you can't see this image, but it comes up later on. At the top of the roof is something called a shanarak, which is very, very crucial to the individual Kazakh identity. So it's worked its way into a lot of the images of Kazakhstan, but it would allow the smoke coming out from the home to exit, essentially, so that it didn't, the yurt itself didn't fill up with smoke. You can see a little bit on this photo on the left. There's some of the skeleton of the yurt because it's made up of poles and coverings. So there's a little bit of this lattice shape, as you can see, and then the coverings that would be laid over top are often layered. There would be a more insulating layer of wool or felt, and then a more element-resistant layer on the outside to protect from precipitation. So here is a image of some more basic yurts, so much plainer, although you can see on this one on the right here up close, there is it's more of a traditional embroidery symbol element kind of thing. You'd see this sometimes chained together as a border, but that sort of swirly and cross spear thing, I don't really know how to describe it, but that's very common in a lot of their decoration. This community here is a medium to larger size community. Often you will just see a single yurt by itself that would house an extended family or maybe two together, but this is a larger community. And here you can get a better look at, there's a little bit of the shanarak, but mainly the poles that are used, the lattice style shape at the base, and then the curved poles that go up to the crown, the shanarak, which also helps a little bit with stability. This was actually taken at a festival as part of a kind of cultural festival and celebration. They have competitions for who can set up a yurt the fastest, which I found very fun, that it's now a bit of a game because it would actually be quite important in winter months to set up, when it's raining and you're going camping, you want to set up your tent very quickly. So there is actually quite a bit of skill that goes into it, into the making of a yurt as well. And here I have some images of the shanarak. On the left here we have a postage stamp which features the Kazakh emblem, and that would be a bit more of a decorative representation, but there's three poles that from two separate sections that cross over to form this sort of X shape that has a encircling hoop, so that would go at the top to allow the smoke out. And then here on the right, this is the flag of Kyrgyzstan. So a lot of this people group also live in Kyrgyzstan now, and so it's made its way into the flag as well. So very important in kind of as a symbol of the indigenous community. I wanted to also briefly touch on some things that have worked their way into modern practices but are pretty exclusively Kazakh. So on the left here we have what is called shashlik, which is essentially they're meat kebabs, but they would be anything from chicken to lamb to beef. You can actually have shashlik in modern restaurants in the urban centers. Very delicious. So so delicious. I miss it a lot actually, and there's depending on the location, a different mixture of seasoning, but that is something that is pretty exclusively Kazakh. And then here on the right, we have an image of some naan. Now, naan is like yurt and Kafkas, more of an umbrella term. It doesn't describe a specific thing. But the bread, or the naan, that you see pictured here is pretty exclusively Kazakh. I haven't seen it a whole lot. Most of the time, the naan you can get here or in other parts of the world is much flatter, whereas with this, you can see in the outer ring, it's a lot fluffier. There's some air pockets in there. And at the center, they actually stamp it with a unique symbol that's very specific to the bakery or the type of naan that's made, which I always found really interesting, that there's a little bit of art in everything that they do, from their clothing to their housing to even their bread. So I really want to touch on that as well. Now, briefly, I wanted to talk about some of the modern pressures that the nomadic Kazakh people have faced throughout history, because it's put a pressure now on modern nomadic Kazakhs to really make an effort to ensure that their individual cultural identity remains, that it's not assimilated into another culture, it is so sadly a common story in other places of the world. So under the USSR and Stalin's 5-year plans, a lot of the nomadic peoples were forced to become sedentary, and either were sent into the factories and the workhouses, or were forced into agricultural practices and become haymakers to supply this epic plan that Stalin had for progress. So they were not allowed to continue in their natural ways, or if they were, there was a great deal of pressure to conform to Stalin's rule. And so that was a very sad part of their history, where there was a lot of repression there. Another very sad aspect of their cultural history was the Turkestan and Steppe Statutes of 1867 and 1868, which are very complicated scenarios and documents, but essentially there was some laws that came into play that did not acknowledge the difference between the sedentary and the nomadic peoples in Kazakhstan, which are two very different lifestyles that were not properly acknowledged. So not only was it a bit of an insult to their identity as a culture, but also like the collectivization and colonization under the USSR, it restricted their natural way of life. And this says historical, but this is actually more modern day. So they continue to face pressures today in modern times. There is quite a bit of pollution in Kazakhstan. It's a developing country, so a lot of the power and the electrical work for city centers comes from coal. So there's a lot of air pollution that affects the quality of life outside of the city, where they rely. They can't go inside and have air fresheners or anything like that. So that plays a pretty huge part into their life now in modern times. But also ground pollution is another thing. Water pollution. There's a lot of pollution in Kazakhstan, unfortunately. Another huge thing is resource demand. A lot of land in Kazakhstan is being used now to expand urban centers, so there's a bit of a pressure from that. And in turn, resource demand such as the trees or the animals, there's a constant pressure to come into the city centers and expand that way. And as well, in these city centers, there is still a lasting sentiment from the time of the Soviet Union. So there's quite a few Russian people in Kazakhstan today, and there's sort of a white superiority sentiment in Kazakhstan as well, which is very sad. So the Kazakh people, who are naturally darker skinned, face some racial persecution as well. And finally, just to wrap up, because I'm already over time, I've thought I should do this without a script to be a little bit more engaging, but I'm seeing now that that may have been a mistake. No matter. So some of the similarities to the Canadian Indigenous peoples include the housing. So there's very distinct visual similarity between yurts and teepees. So just the circular shape as well as the opening at the top to allow smoke out, the poles and the coverings. There's so many similarities between the housing. So I thought that was very interesting. And as someone who's really interested in architecture, I wondered how some of these principles could be brought into more in modern housing as well, how we can use more natural resources to maintain temperature and comforts and all that. Migration was another thing that was very similar. It's very common that the Plains people in Canada migrated with the buffalo, and I found that that was a bit of a similarity with the migration of the Kazakh people's herds as well. They both value land very highly and rely on it for their sustenance. There's a much greater appreciation for land that I find in both Indigenous cultures than in the more modern Western lifestyle. The cultural persecution, sadly, I found very similar as well, with the idea of a foreign white power coming in and wanting to expand using their land and their resources, and in turn with that, the land loss. So I didn't want to dwell too much on this point because I didn't want to be repetitive, but I'm sure it's very obvious some of the similarities between the two, which I found really helpful as well in gaining appreciation for both cultures, seeing how this isn't their way of life isn't an isolated tradition, but it's really widespread on a global scale that, it made me really think maybe we have a thing or two to learn, or more than a thing or two to learn from these people and their way of life. And that's all for my presentation. Here were the references for the images I used in the PowerPoint. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.